Last episode we talked about how there are multiple different versions of the Transformers story. But now you may be wondering, if these different stories aren't connected to one another, why is it that so many characters exist across all of them? Why is there an Optimus Prime and a Bumblebee in both the films and the cartoon if they don't have anything to do with one another? And those are just the obvious ones. Sometimes you'll see names reused in ways that are totally unrelated. For our second episode, that's what we're going to talk about. Understanding why characters and names repeat across Transformers history requires going back to the beginning. You see, character was a huge reason for the success of the original Transformers series. Every toy had a bio included on its packaging that described the character's personality. But for some reason, Hasbro didn't quite grasp just how important these individual characters were. They obviously didn't raise any objections when characters like Blaster, Shockwave, and Grimlock were portrayed with very different personalities in the cartoons versus the Marvel comic. To Hasbro, they were just product. But that way of thinking came back to bite them in 1986's The Transformers the Movie, which saw a large chunk of the 1984 cast casually killed off due to the fact that their toys had been discontinued and replaced with new product. Kids obviously reacted with horror to the deaths of the characters they'd been watching on TV for 2 years, especially Optimus Prime, and Hasbro woke up to the significance that their characters held for their audience. As the Generation 1 toy line wound on, this revelation inspired Hasbro to release new toys of old characters, including Optimus Prime, Jazz, Bumblebee, Starscream, and Grimlock. 1990's Action Master range was crammed with old faces. Generation 2 also featured many returning old favourites, and when the Beast era began, learning from their previous mistake, Hasbro made sure it featured an Optimus and a Megatron of its own, although the Beast Wars cartoon would explain that these were new characters who took their names from their more famous ancestor. But where the reuse of Optimus and Megatron's names was intended to evoke the original characters, the Beast era was also the inflection point for a second phenomenon, the reuse of old names for new characters, unrelated to the originals. Such instances in Beast Wars were limited, and names were generally used because they fitted the character's beast mode. For example, Buzzsaw was a Condor in Generation 1, but the Beast Wars character was a Wasp. Beast Machines did the same, but it also began to apply these reused names in a way that did evoke their history. For example, the names Mirage and Scavenger, used in Generation 1 for a race car and a construction vehicle, were applied to new characters with similar alternate modes. The reason for these reuses was trademarks. Hasbro had lost the trademarks to several classic names and would later be forced to create new replacements, which is why you'll discover some characters have had more than one name throughout their history. For example, Bluestreak famously became Silverstreak for several years. To keep the names, they had to reuse them on new toys. It was during the anime years of Robots in Disguise and the Unicron trilogy that these two practices, new versions of old favourites and the casual reuse of older names for new characters, really kicked into high gear. As the first true reboot of Transformers, the Unicron trilogy featured many of these legacy characters, ones whose depictions remained generally consistent with their Generation 1 selves, who adhered to a specific character archetype and or visual, ones who, simply put, were recognisable as new or alternate versions of the classic characters like Optimus Prime, Starscream, Rodimus, Shockwave, Soundwave, and others. The opposite side of that coin, however, was that the reuse of other non-legacy names became so rampant that they started to lose any unique association. And while some names would keep to a pattern, for instance, Prowl became the go-to name for virtually any character with a police-themed alternate mode, regardless of that character's personality or role in the story, other names began to be repeatedly applied to wildly different characters, to the point where it felt like it was being done at random. Take a look at this guy from the Unicron trilogy, for instance. Now, given how much he's visually based on the Generation 1 character, it'd be logical to assume he's Wheeljack, right? Wrong! He's Downshift. He couldn't be named Wheeljack because another Unicron trilogy character had already taken the name, despite the fact that he had no connection to the G1 character. And so Downshift wound up having to take the name of another, different, more obscure Generation 1 character, who he didn't have anything to do with. It was a confusing and a messy time for Transformers names, and it even continued into the live-action movies. Take Ironhide, for instance. Though his inclusion in the film was clearly inspired by the prominence of the classic character, the movie character has nothing to do with the original. And why should he? For the preceding decade, Ironhide was a name that, like I said, had been virtually used at random, applied to a Beast Wars elephant, a female Minicon from Armada, and an impetuous Autobot rookie in Energon. But the success of the film put Ironhide back on the A-list. After the movie, Hasbro couldn't get away with using that name at random again. He joined the ranks of the legacy characters, and subsequent lines like Animated and Prime synthesized the movie and Generation 1 character designs to reflect that, with the random uses in between all but forgotten. This kind of reconsolidation is how things tend to work today, as Hasbro have tightened up their casual reuse of names in the post-movie years, especially with the inception of the Aligned continuity. New versions of legacy characters continue to appear in every new Transformers series, which is why you'll always see an Optimus Prime, a Bumblebee, a Starscream, but other names are far less randomly applied. And though Ironhide is an example of how the weight of history usually leads the original version of the character to be the dominant influence in modern portrayals, there are instances where more recent holders of a name have won out as the definitive version. For example, the name Bulkhead was first used for a Unicron Trilogy character, a crazy old Autobot coot who turned into a helicopter. And if we're being honest, in true Unicron Trilogy style, even for the first use of the name, it still didn't seem especially relevant to the character. But then, the name was reused in Transformers Animated for a character who fitted it to a T, a lovable Autobot lug with big muscles and a bigger heart. And that was it. The name now meant something. And in the very next series, Transformers Prime, there was Bulkhead, a new incarnation of the character for a new continuity, yet barely changed from Animated. So you see, it's not as if the practice of reusing names for brand new characters has completely disappeared. There are still non-legacy names whose random history means that they're still searching for a definitive character to attach themselves to. Prime's own Knockout is a perfect example. Before he came along, that name was one of the most randomly applied in Transformers history, going from a Generation 1 Micromaster, to an Armada Minicon, to a Movieverse motorcycle, and more, none of whom had anything to do with each other. But now, the name is definitively his. Something that's begun to happen in the wake of this tightening up, however, is that it's actually become harder to separate out distinct incarnations of characters from one another. As you might have inferred from our previous episode on continuity and how it's divided up into families, fans really like to put things into neat little boxes, and when it came to characters, for a long time, that was easily done. G1 Ironhide, Energon Ironhide, Movie Ironhide, all very separate characters, each in their own box. But now, with the current level of increased effort to give names meaning and have them be associated with a particular definitive version of a character, when that character gets adapted into another continuity, it's becoming increasingly more common for them to be all but identical in a way that just didn't happen before, even with big-name legacy characters. We've seen it with Windblade in the Robots in Disguise cartoon and Knockout in the IDW comics, to name just two, and as such, it becomes harder to see them as different characters, the way we were able to separate them out in the past. That's entirely on purpose, of course. Hasbro has never had any interest in drawing lines around incarnations of characters. The way they look at it, it's not that there's a separate G1 character and a separate movie character and a separate Aligned character. To them, there's just a character who appears different ways in different series. Some similar, and some very different. And increased similarity across all versions of the brand is just good synergy. It's only likely to continue as Transformers marches forward, so you're best off getting used to it and accepting that when you dive into Transformers history, you'll discover characters with the same name who are virtually identical, who share only some similarities, or who are nothing alike at all. Boy, this is pretty complicated stuff, huh? We'll take it a little easier next week and dig into some lore as we examine what makes a Transformer. Sparks, brain modules, T-Cogs and more, all on the next episode of The Basics. Make sure and subscribe so you don't miss it, and you can support the show and my other endeavours on Patreon by clicking the link in the video. See you next week for episode 3.